Hey, good afternoon, aviators and aviation fans. This is Mike, the Chili Dog pilot. Hope you guys are all doing well. So I'm back in the Tomahawk. I just picked her up this morning from her annual inspection. So I'm just taking her out for a quick flight just to check make sure everything is working well. I did a very short flight from Penn Ridge Airport back to Doylestown when I picked it up. Then I had some things I had to do, and now I'm back giving it another flight. And since I'm just coming out of annual, I figure this is a good time to do yet another episode of the Airplane Ownership Costs series. And since we just came out of annual, I think the topic for this episode is really around maintenance. And so we're going to break down the maintenance into two areas. The first area is scheduled maintenance, and then the second area is the as-needed maintenance. So that could either come in the terms of just from normal wear and tear, or if there was some sort of breakage or just issue that arose and you have to do maintenance to get that repaired. And so what I'm going to do, I think, for this video is talk about some of this while we're flying. And then the other part, I'm going to show some graphs, and I'm going to give full transparency in what my costs have been in owning the Tomahawk, and share with you kind of what that journey looks like. And that will be more voiceover, and then I'll throw some numbers up there for you to review as well. So to start off, I think let's talk about scheduled maintenance, right? So for every aircraft owner, the one thing that you need to do as far as scheduled maintenance is the annual inspection. So in order to keep your airplane airworthy, you need to do an annual inspection, and that's as duly noted every 12 months. And so if you have an annual inspection like I did here in May, my next annual inspection will be due at the end of May next year. And so the annual inspection actually consists of two parts, right? There is the inspection. So that is the initial thing that your MP is going to do, is they're going to open up the airplane, they're going to check all the elements of the airplane to make sure all the systems are working, and if there's anything that's either worn or needs repair, and they're going to note that down. And then they're also going to check your aircraft against any ADs that are out there, and then many of those might be based on a time cycle, an hour cycle, or are just flash up things that you need to do every annual. And so they will take care of that. You know, other things that could happen during the annual could also be your ELT battery and ELT check. That's also due every year. And so that's generally what an annual is. And so that is generally a known cost for the inspection portion, and then another cost for any repairs that need to happen along that way. So as a PIC and owner, one of the things I will do is if there's little things that are happening in the airplane, if they are not things that are going to ground the aircraft, I could defer them to annual. Otherwise, they're going to fall into that other category. But before we get into that, there's some other scheduled things that you need to do as an aircraft owner. The big one, I would say, besides the ELT battery check, which I think usually coincides with an annual, unless there is a time limit on the battery, then that battery will need to be switched by the due date on the battery. So like in my case, my annual was obviously done in May of 2026. But when I look at the battery for my ELT, that needs to be replaced at the end of February 2027. So that will be something that will occur prior to me going to the next annual. The nice thing is that is a preventative maintenance type operation, so I as the owner can also do that. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too. Another type of scheduled maintenance that I think everybody needs to go through is the pedostatic check and the transponder check. So the pedostatic might just strictly, is one for instrument flying, obviously, and then you also need to do that every 2 years. And then the same with the transponder. You just need to have the transponder checked every 2 years as well. And so typically those are both done at the same time, and they basically hook the machine up to a calibration tool, and they'll just ensure that the pedostatic is working properly and the transponder is emitting the proper altitude based on that feed. So aside from that, the only other scheduled type of maintenance that could occur is for those of you who are using your airplane in a commercial setting. So if you are either leasing your airplane back to a flight school, you are renting it out for some reason, or you are giving flight instruction in there, and you're doing that as a source of income or a commercial operation, then your airplane is also going to require a 100-hour inspection. And so that is pretty much equivalent to an annual inspection, but it's just to, again, ensure the airworthy of probably what would be considered a higher utilized aircraft. So every 100 hours you would do the full inspection, and then again repair any issues along the way. So that being said, those are kind of the major time-driven things, right? It's the annual inspection, the 100-hour inspection, the ELT check, and then the pedostatic and transponder check. So those are the things that you always need to just keep a logbook of and make sure that you do not let any of those items lapse. Otherwise, that's going to make the aircraft unworthy. Now, the part that none of us can predict or anticipate are the wear and tear type of maintenance that may need to happen. So that could be anything from, and I'll give you some examples of that I've personally experienced. It could be, a flat tire. It could be a tire that's not holding air. I had, at one point in time, a really bad nose shimmy on my nose wheel. The Tomahawks tend to be a little bit susceptible to that to begin with because they don't have a dampener. And, just the slightest overage or underage of air pressure, the position of the strut, all those things could institute a nose shimmy, as well as some, loose shims or what have you. So they can be annoying at the least bit, and then if they get really bad, they can be, semi-violent. And then, where I worry about with that is it creating other problems for the aircraft. So I've had that be an issue. So far, knock on wood, I've had very minor non-scheduled maintenance. The only other thing was the instrument panel. As you can see here in today's video, I still do not have my JPI engine monitor. It is back from the shop. I just now got to figure out time to be able to take it up to the avionics company and get it put back in, and then hopefully we could see that everything is working well with that. I can tell you with my club airplanes, some of the other things we've had issues with, are unsuspected or not planned. Could be fuel leaks. We've had situations with, exhaust hoses coming off. We've had trim issues at times where in the airplanes, especially that have the electric trim, either the trim motor or something happens where that goes inoperative, and then obviously the problem with that is many times the autopilot's also driven by it, so that also renders the autopilot. So those are things that you probably want to address and fix as soon as possible when those issues come up. I'm trying to think if there's any other major ones that are off the top of my head, but bottom line, and I'm going to go through the numbers here in a little bit, but as you encounter these issues, first and foremost as a pilot, your safety should be top of mind, not only for yourself, but keep in mind, when you're flying and aviating, you are doing that over many times the population, and you do not want to generate an emergency where you can harm those below you as well. So, as an aircraft owner, I think you really need to have the mentality that safety is first and foremost in anything you do, and as much as possible, take care of those maintenance issues and stay ahead of them. And ideally, everything should be more in the preventative nature, and that way you're not dealing with repairs other than the things that sometimes happen, outside your control. So with that being said, I'm going to now transition into a little bit of just what my experience has been in the Tomahawk itself, and go through, all the annuals I've had as well as the other repairs. And then that will kind of give you just a little bit of preview of, one of the other costs that you're going to experience as an aircraft owner. I think I said in the earlier video that when I first did the overview of aircraft ownership, I think generally, having probably $10,000 available or in the ready in case you have either a maintenance issue or other things that come up. And then we'll also talk about how I plan for my annuals. And that number kind of fluctuates, based on the wear and tear on the airplane. But I'll tell you, kind of based on the last 4 annuals I have, what I kind of anticipate for annuals. And obviously, just like that $10,000 for unexpected maintenance, I have money aside for annual stuff. And then, the last part of that is you should always also, in my opinion, put together what I would call an upgrade fund. So that is just extra money that either can cover some unexpected costs, or if over time you have a nice surplus in there, you can do some sort of upgrade. And I'll tell you again, we do this from a club perspective as well. So we calculate a reserve for many of the things that need replacing, but we also put in an upgrade fund, and that allows us to do things like either avionics upgrade, maybe a autopilot upgrade. The list can go on, and obviously that's also based on your desires and choices. It might even be simple things like upgrading the windshield, maybe some of the interior upgrade. All things that, will obviously just, give your plane a better look and feel, and especially if you own it, you want it to be something that, makes you happy and that you enjoy. And again, so with that, let me go ahead and go to some voiceover stuff and walk you through some of my numbers, and then we'll close out once we're done here.
Okay, so for the next few minutes, we're going to talk about my maintenance experience with the Tomahawk since I first picked it up in 2022. A couple things to note that this is mainly illustrative. It's going to vary greatly based on the type of aircraft you have and your local rates, depending on where you're located. On the sheet, you see kind of an itemized account for all the maintenance that we have done. So I have it sorted out by year, and then I have kind of a brief description of what each maintenance item is, and then I also highlighted the annual inspections as well as the engine overhaul. We're going to talk about engine overhaul at a future date because I want to spend more time talking about all the concepts around that. And then what you see is in the first totals is the complete totals for the year. That includes all maintenance of all types. And then I break and split out both the ongoing maintenance issues as well as annuals. And so you can see what those annual costs are per year. So let's start with the annuals. And as you can see here, they range anywhere from about $6,000 to as low as $2,300. But the average is probably in the $4,800 mark. And I have a table that shows how I continue to keep track of the annuals and divide those over the number of annuals to see what that total cost is. So for budgeting purposes for the annual expense, I basically have taken the last 4 annuals that I've had and averaged that price out and kind of used that as my planning budget for each upcoming annual. So right now that basically amounts to about $5,000 for each year, and then I obviously budget some wiggle room in case it goes over or under. And then what I also do, and I'll show this sheet in a moment, but I also track the number of hours the airplane flies each year. And right now that budget of time is about 113 hours. Obviously keep in mind I had an overhaul one year, so that was about 6 months of non-flying. But if I wanted to break it out to an hourly cost, what I on average would expect an annual to cost me is about $43 per hour based on the current run rates of both the annual as well as the number of hours flown. But that being said, I track this more as a fixed cost, as I mentioned earlier. So I plan for $5,000 and expect anywhere from a 10 to 20% swing based on what gets done that particular year. So going back to the big maintenance sheet, you'll notice I only have 2 oil changes listed here, and that's primarily because I do the oil changes myself. So other than the very first oil change in which I wanted to watch an A&P do it, and then the oil change that was subsequent to my engine reinstall when we switched out the mineral oil for regular oil, all other oil changes have been done by myself. And so here's kind of the planning chart that I do to account for those oil changes. So I factor the oil change into the hourly cost of the airplane operation, and I calculated that by using what I pay for each oil filter, the amount I spent on oil, as well as cam guard, which brings me to a total of $98, and then I divide that by 50 hours since that is the interval on which I change oil. And so therefore, when we go to the operational cost, you'll see that oil is factored into it utilizing this equation here. So as we discussed, the annual cost is factored in as a fixed cost since I know what that price is going to be just about every year with some variables. For all other maintenance, including oil changes, what I end up doing is taking an average cost per hour and then utilizing that amount to kind of build a reserve for maintenance each year, and then also have some extra wiggle room in case we do go above that. The starting basis for that obviously is knowing how many hours the airplane flies each year, which you can see in this chart here. And on average, I'm probably getting closer to 130 to 140 hours per year. 2024 was a little bit of a differential because that is the year I did the engine overhaul, so the plane was dormant for about 6 months. So once I have my average number of hours per year, I then calculate the amount of maintenance that was done each year outside of annual, and those are the costs here. And as you can see, I also calculated what that maintenance cost would be over the per hour for that year. And then what I end up doing with this information is combine those two things to build out a variable engine cost. So the last thing I put into my overall hourly cost is a engine TBO reserve. And I basically take the amount that an engine overhaul costs and divide it over the TBO time, which is 2,400 hours, and that gives me an hourly cost that I build into each hour of flying. As I said before, I'm going to do a whole nother episode on the engine overhaul, so we're going to go into those numbers in greater depth. But as a result of that, I now have a nice chart that kind of shows me what all my hourly costs are for flying the airplane. So after we factor in the annual hours the aircraft has flown, as well as the annual maintenance outside of annual, I'm able to build a hourly cost for operating the airplane. Obviously, the one cost that we know that's going to impact the airplane is the number of gallons of fuel we burn each hour in flying. Right now I'm using $6 as the base case, knowing that the airplane flies at 6.5 gallons an hour on average. As I mentioned earlier, we already calculated what the oil change per hour costs, taking that total oil change cost and dividing it by 50 hours, and so that gives us $1.96. The engine replacement is based off of the TBO time, and that's I think a safe number. As I mentioned before, this engine has gone over TBO in the past, so any additional hours past the 2400 is a nice cost savings. And then we're also going to use the average hourly cost for all the maintenance outside of annual to get factored into the cost as well. And so when I combine all that together, that is an hourly cost of $9.91 for all the maintenance that could potentially happen on the airplane. I also add an additional $2 fund per hour that goes towards an upgrade fund, and that's if I do any other types of things that maybe are not necessarily needed as part of maintenance, but something I want to do to improve the airplane. So in total, based on the past 4 years, my hourly cost for operating the Tomahawk is about $71. If I factor in the annual costs that I also shared with you, that price obviously goes up to $113. But as I said before, I basically keep the annual as a fixed cost and everything else as a variable cost. So speaking of fixed costs, let me show you what I also calculate for the fixed costs for the airplane. And these are costs that will happen regardless of how much or how little I fly the airplane. So as I talked about a few weeks ago in my intro video, when it comes to owning an aircraft, you're going to have both fixed and variable costs. And by and large, your variable costs really stem down to maintenance, whereas your fixed costs are all your other items. So as you see here, I track what my fixed costs are for owning this airplane. And again, these costs will stay the same regardless if I fly the airplane or not. They include the GPS subscription, insurance, hangars, and then miscellaneous. And the miscellaneous is really just a slush fund I keep in case things come up that are not expected. And then when you look at the total of all those items, it works out to about $511 a month, and you can see the breakdown here. Technically, annuals are also a fixed cost. I put them at the bottom, but as you can see, when you combine the annual costs as well as all the other fixed costs, we're looking at about $915 per month to maintain all the fixed elements of the airplane.
All right, folks, so I think you hopefully got a chance there to look at some of the maintenance costs that can occur for you as an aircraft owner. I mean, obviously the Tomahawk is just illustrative of what you can expect to spend, but what you do know is at a minimum you're going to spend money on an annual inspection and any repairs that are needed each year. Other costs obviously are going to be some of the expected costs that you'll have, like oil changes, and then there's the third category, which is the repairs that may happen, or just as needed maintenance that could occur during the year as well. So by and large, what I do, as I mentioned a couple times now, is I kind of have in my mind approximately $10,000 that's kind of set aside for all those things that could happen for the aircraft. Obviously, based on the airplane, you may want to adjust your numbers, and obviously as you own an aircraft, and the longer you own it, you start to get a feel for what those costs will entail. So if you have any questions, please let me know. One of the other things I'm going to talk about in one of the upcoming episodes are some of the other expenses that you could incur as an owner. Both of those happen for me. So one will be going through an engine overhaul process. We can talk about all the options there for when your engine is either at TBO or is at that point where it needs an overhaul. And then panel upgrades. So those are two things that are, I don't want to say are optional, but are things that may not happen in the time that you own the aircraft. I think when we maybe circle back to aircraft purchasing, I think, if you're able to, you can get, the ideal situation is to get an airplane that has a low time engine and has the panel you want, because the case of the panel, you generally are not going to get your money back when you invest it. All right, so with that being said, as always, I appreciate you watching, and I certainly welcome any feedback you may have. And we will have another one of these episodes in the not too distant future. And until then, please join me again for other flights, whether they're instrument flying or just touring around the local area.